Hey guys, welcome to the last lecture in our series on the American War of Independence. Today we are going to wrap it up by talking about some of the effects of the war on the American colonies, now states, and we will also finish by taking a look at, looking back at the overall revolution, the impact it had, and really kind of the nature of the revolution, what political impacts it had, what social impacts it made, because America and frankly the world would never be the same after this. And I know sometimes we like to, talk about American exceptionalism, and that's a whole separate issue. But, in many ways, this was the spark of a new chapter of world history, because empires are now going to be clinging on to the remaining parts of empire, and what we're going to see, especially the rise of, worldwide empires, especially as they go into places like Africa. But this was proof that no matter how strong the power, the people could fight back and gain their independence and fight for what was right. So let's go ahead and get rolling with it. Let me get this all switched around. All right. So the effects of the war. We're going to begin here, part 3. So first of all, let's talk about the population impact. There were about 25,000 American military deaths. Now, today, sadly, that number may not seem like that much, but you have to understand, a much smaller population overall at the time. This accounted for 1%, right around 1% of the population. That is a tremendous impact, okay? When you lose 1% of the population to war, that is actually a very large percent. In fact, it's the second biggest percent out of any war that America would fight, except for, of course, the Civil War. So 1% of the American population will die during the American Revolution. Now, one interesting side note, and I'm reminded of, right now I'm filming this. It's September of 2020. We are still in this pandemic. I'm reminded of the Spanish flu that took place in 1918 and 1919. A lot of that kind of got covered up by World War I, right? That was going on at the same time. During this war, during the American Revolution, there was another pandemic happening, and it was a smallpox pandemic. There were actually many, many more people that were dying because of the smallpox than the war itself. The worst smallpox epidemic in North American history. There were about somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people that died during this period from the smallpox disease. Now, some tried to avoid it. In fact, if you watch the HBO series John Adams, there's a very grisly scene of the Adams family trying to prevent smallpox by actually infecting themselves. This is an early form of vaccination, but they would literally slice open, part of the skin, often on the shoulder, and put a kind of a less violent strain. They even had what were called pox parties, in which they would try to inoculate family members, and it was called taking the pox. But either way, about 100,000 people end up dying from smallpox during this exact same period. So, you have this tremendous impact on the population of America. Besides just those that are dying because of disease and war, you also had a lot of people leave. The Loyalist departure had a lot of impact on America as well. Tens of thousands of loyalists before the war, during the war, and towards the end, they are going to be leaving, for fear of their safety, or just believing that the country's getting shot to where. Overall, we've looked at numbers of loyalists before in our lectures. It was most likely somewhere between 20 and 30%. Most people were not loyalists, but it was a good fraction, right? So somewhere between 20 and 30%. John Adams famously said, a third loyalist, third patriot, third neutral. We do know that 20,000 loyalists fought for the crown during the war. There were thousands others that actually served in local militias. We looked at one of those battles last time. But all told, there were somewhere around 60 to 80,000 people that left the American colonies during this war. Most of them headed for Canada, some of them headed for Great Britain. Many did return afterwards, but of course some stayed. I mean, it was not as simple as jumping in your car and traveling across country at that time. Now, what this did, you think about, now you've lost people to disease, you've lost people to war, you've lost people that have simply moved away and immigrated. What this does is it created a vacuum at the top levels of government in particular, and those would often be filled by patriots. So those that were, still here, that was filled by patriots, and so you have kind of this turnover. I'm going to talk about it at the very end on the political revolution, the nature of the political side. But you had this vacuum that formed in not just government, but also business, where all these loyalists take off. Well, that empty space is filled by other people. So, you do have some rapidly changing parts of politics and economics. And of course, those loyalists who did leave, who left their property here, a lot of times their property or land was sold and changed hands. Even though we did see in our last lecture that the Treaty of Paris did protect loyalist property in name. In reality, I'm sure some of them, did not get them back. Now, one group that we have not talked about specifically was slaves during this period. Now, part of this, we need to understand that slavery at this time did appear a little bit different. Ultimately, slavery has not peaked in this country yet. We are still before the invention of the cotton gin, and especially given, where the American colonies are, slavery just did not have as big of a role. I'm not trying to minimize it, but just understanding that it doesn't have as big of a role as it will in the early 1800s, okay? It will, of course, grow, and this evil institution will become even more powerful. But a lot of these colonies, and perhaps I should have gotten into this earlier on, the middle colonies and those lower southern colonies, that is where primarily the slaves were located. But you think about the types of farming that they're engaging in, it's not nearly as labor intensive as what will come later as we begin to spread westward into places like Mississippi and Alabama. Cotton is not the main crop of America at this time. Tobacco is the main crop that is being farmed, and frankly, you just don't need as many hands picking that. So, I'm not trying to minimize the role of slaves. They absolutely were here. It absolutely was an evil institution that would need to be dealt with eventually. And sadly, many of the leaders at this time will choose to put that off for their grandchildren to fight and die over. This is America's gravest sin, and I think we need to recognize the evil that it is to own another human being, and that shouldn't even be a debatable topic. Now, so let's talk about the effects on slaves here in America. So, the British, as they were marching through the American colonies, they actually did end up freeing tens of thousands of slaves. Now, the catch was that those freed slaves were expected then to join up with the British military, and they were expected to join the ranks of the military and continue on. Some after the war were settled in places like Canada. Other were settled in places like the West Indies, Caribbean. I think it's interesting to denote that the war did disrupt a little bit about slave and slave ownership, but ultimately, the role of slaves in this early colonial society was much lower than it would be later on. Really a small minority even owned slaves at this time because it was very expensive to own a slave. Often doing housework, less agricultural impact than what we would see, as I said, later on. Anyways, the slaves, we are going to come back. That this will be a major part of this entire class is slaves and the impact that they have on American history. Moving on to the economic impact of the American Revolution. One thing this did by pushing the British out, it did allow for new sources of wealth to be found, to be explored. As I said, even with those loyalists leaving, that presents a lot of business opportunity for those that remain here, and someone is going to step up and fill those voids. Especially considering that, right after the war ends, we do begin to trade with Britain again and kind of return to a lot of the pre-war economic levels. Somebody has to be organizing that and benefiting from that trade. And so, there was a positive impact following the war. More new people are participating in the economy than ever before. So domestic manufacturing is growing, and as we now own all the land to the west of Mississippi, we are starting to see people move westward. That's always been the goal, and so domestic manufacturing is growing with that. Trade is moving in some ways kind of inward. The abroad trade is still happening, but trade is going to become more impactful inward, and that's actually going to change. The importance of waterways. Okay, rivers are going to be extremely important in the development of the early republic, because think about it. If you have, if you are trying to get goods out of, say, Ohio, you have to use rivers to do that. You can't fly them out. So we're going to see a big influence on building things like canals, building things like new roads. So the economic impact is turning inward here to try and make sure that those demands are met. Excuse me. And again, with the westward movement, I mean, the population impact there, it is growing rapidly and moving westward. I should mention here the impact on Native Americans. They are a marginalized group that often gets pushed off to the side. We read about it a little bit in your readings, especially with Zen. But the Native American populations are starting to experience that westward movement and getting pushed off of their lands. This will just continue to get worse, of course. And so, they continually pick the wrong side to support. They picked the wrong side in the French and Indian War. They picked the wrong side of the American Revolution to support, and they're continuing to pay the consequences of that. Not rightfully so. I'm just saying that keep picking the wrong side. So as they're getting pushed off their land. I think it's important to understand the American perspective there. Not saying it's right, but just the feelings at the time. There was definitely a sense of racial superiority to the Native American populations, most of which are still living in these tribal formats and half naked. So they were seen as savages that were not using the land properly. Most tribes had not taken to farming even at this point. So they're looked at as a very backwards people. They're looked at really as the enemy because they just had been the enemy. Many of them had allied themselves with the British, and ultimately now, even though they're within the American political borders, they are still seen as really foreign enemies. They're seen as foreign nations, so they will not be given equal protection under the law. So this is going to be something that we look at later on, but they will continue to feel the effects of that. So just want to make sure I didn't mention that, not as much on the economic impact, but if you want to kind of lump that in kind of with slaves as well, the social impact is quite important there. All right, well let's kind of transition to our last section here, and kind of step back, and as we now understand the war itself, the causes, the fighting itself, let's take a look at what effect it had. What was the nature of the revolution itself. We began our unit by trying to understand was this truly revolutionary? Okay, and I heard some great debate on that. What began as really a struggle for rights as Englishmen became a fight for independence. It completely changed the course of what was happening as this age of enlightenment culminated in this push for political independence. But the root of all this was that period of enlightenment, these ideas of contract theory, of the social contract between people and their government, and that government, providing security and defending rights. Britain was not doing that in their mind, and they had the power to and the right to overthrow that government. Issues of popular sovereignty. Who is in control, right? From the very beginning, there were issues, with salutary neglect, where Britain still felt like they were in control of us, but we're doing our own thing for 100 plus years, and we've believed that we were sovereign. The issue of sovereignty is not going to go away, the debate about that. In fact, it's just going to turn inward. We are going to start discussing that within the beginning of our next unit, because we are going to lay the foundation for the Civil War that'll be coming 60 years down the road, which completely deals with issues of sovereignty. Who is sovereign here? Is it the states, or is it the federal government? Who is in control? And we fight an entire war about that. So what we see, the one big impact of the revolution answers that question. So what we see is all these states that are forming, they all write their own constitutions. And it's a really good glimpse as to understanding what each state really felt strongly about at that time period. And you'll notice some trends if you really start to study those. Number one, you'll see that all early state constitutions deal strongly with the separation of powers. Right? They wanted this system of checks and balances that would not allow one entity, especially the executive role, to expand and have too much power. Almost all of them include a separate written Bill of Rights, okay? A Bill of Rights that protects the right of the individual, protects the right to petition, that protects the right of freedom of speech, that protects the individual with a fair and speedy trial. We are seeing a glimpse of what is to come. Now, keep in mind the American government as a federal system will not exist for 7 more years. War ends in 82 and Constitution's written in 89. So 7 more years before we actually see the Constitution take shape. But you better believe that our U.S. Constitution, a lot of it is based off of the state constitutions that are being written at this time. So was the American Revolution revolutionary? Well, it is debatable, but the fact that we see a lot of the first wave of those state constitutions having so many of those rights that we eagerly defend and swear by in the Bill of Rights and in the U.S. Constitution, they're forming here. I mean, this is a result of the revolution. So. And it is revolutionary. No government on earth had defined, the protection of these rights of the individual yet. And so, I think so often, history teachers try to portray, all of America history as bright and shiny and great. It wasn't that. Some teachers do the opposite and all negative. It wasn't that either. It was truly a combination. But in this sense, I think it was revolutionary in the sense that, we were able to, lay the foundation for the protection of the individual. And this is really the culmination of the Enlightenment embodied in these state constitutions and eventually what will become the Constitution, U.S. Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Social revolution. Moving on to the last point here. It's been a long unit. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. But let's talk about the social impact that the American Revolution had. There's a lot of questions that were, this throws really the entire social order in question, at least. The old world, right? The old way of doing things has been kind of thrown out the window. And so you do have this new kind of social base that emerges because there was greater political opportunity, number one. All of those old bureaucrats, many of them, are pushed out, all right? They are not a part of this new system, either being British themselves or loyalists having left. So there's that power vacuum we spoke of earlier. But also there's a change happening among representation. We are seeing the establishment of greater property qualifications. Well, I shouldn't say greater. There's actually less property qualifications needed to vote. So the expansion of those that can vote and participate in their government. Now, I'm still talking about a very small percentage. I'm still talking about, white landowner males. No one else had the ability to vote. But we are seeing after the revolution, the ability of people to participate in the government is expanding, and that will continue to expand and should continue to expand. Now, one issue, and again, bringing up that slavery issue, here's another social piece, is that after the revolution, we do start seeing individual, now states, start banning slavery. Okay, I believe Vermont, I don't have it in my notes, but I believe Vermont was the very first to ban slavery. Again, don't quote me on that, but we are starting to see right here, immediately following the revolution, some northern states are starting to say, we don't want any part of slavery. It is an evil institution to own another human being, and we don't want any part of that. We're starting to see this major break that's going to continue to grow. And so in a lot of ways, we're seeing, of course, that's a political side, but it is a social side, where slavery would become illegal in places like Vermont, as I mentioned. Women's status. We haven't really talked too much about the role of women. Women's status, frankly, would not change that much based off of the revolution itself. There were new opportunities, even in business, for women to engage in, but frankly, there's little change overall. So if you take up the position that no, the American Revolution was not revolutionary, that's a fair point as well. I mean, you can use that social piece to answer that question. The revolution, what we do know is that it set in motion kind of this transition from toleration in terms of religious ideas. I haven't talked about religion too much. This toleration of religious dissent to complete freedom of religion in idea of separation of church and state. That is a very controversial issue, the separation of church and state. It is not in the U.S. Constitution. Again, that'll come later on. But there is definitely, multiple founding fathers that write about the need for separating church and state. And frankly, if you really read their writings, at the time, the concern wasn't about the impact it would have on the state. It was actually about the concern that mixing religion and state would actually have on religion. They didn't want to see ministers get up and just start preaching about political issues. They thought that would actually corrupt and taint religion in this country. So interesting perspective how that's kind of changed. Today we kind of see the other side. Oh, we don't want religion as a part of our politics because it corrupts kind of the nature of it, and it's a fair point too. But it was actually a much different viewpoint at that time. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of Unit number 2, the American Revolution. You will soon be getting some pointers on how to prepare for our upcoming exam. We will have an essay that will be due, but as always, guys, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you do not hesitate. If you have any questions, I've gotten a few questions so far, and I love answering those, so please shoot them my way, and I'll be happy to get back to you. Thanks.